Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Chronicles, but we begin the second book of Chronicles. And similarly to the other books that are divided in two, like Samuel and Kings, these books, the book of Divrei Hayamim and Shmuel and Melachim were all originally composed as one book and just divided later on in history for the convenience of publishing them and labeling the chapters and so on. But in our tradition, the obviously these books are just one. However, there is a obvious divide here because the first book really focuses, a little bit on tiny little bit of world history, but mostly on the establishment of the kingdom, the United Kingdom of Israel under all 12 tribes, and the establishment of the David's monarchy and the career of David. So this book now will begin with Shlomo, and it roughly corresponds to a similar division in the book of Kings, which we all studied together here recently, which also divides the Kings 1 and Kings 2 more or less at the same spot. So, and there's clearly a transition. David was primarily kind of finished off the period of Judges, which was a period of back and forth, a period of chaos, a period of fighting and conquering and establishing and settling and so on and so forth, some good, some bad. And David kind of ended off with finally bringing everyone all together, finally getting rid of all the enemies, finally setting up a kingdom so we can move forward and set up the kingdom which we were enjoined to do by God in the Torah. So now Shlomo is presented as the one who sets up the kingdom the way it's supposed to be. And really, every society, every national group looks back to its heyday when so and so was in charge, when we were strong, we were powerful, and the great things about our culture, our society, were all at their height during that time period. And Solomon is presented here in the book of Chronicles as that time period, the time when everything was going the way it should. As we saw with David, the book of Chronicles doesn't focus too much on the negative parts, especially near the end of Shlomo's career, and doesn't really focus too much on the mistakes that he made regarding, too much property, too many wives, and the wives that led him astray, and all the negative stuff is not really focused on here. The focus of this narrative is the focus of Solomon, Shlomo, as a great king, as a wealthy king, as a powerful king, a king who consolidated the kingdom and made it a great kingdom that the world looked up to, and so on. We'll see a similar thing. And again, that kind of coincides with the purpose of the book of Chronicles, which is really to inspire those that are now trying to build a new Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel during the building of the Second Temple period, in that time period, and inspire them by giving them a vision of the heights that they could reach if they got it all together. So let's start. Vayischazek Shlomo ben David al Malchuso, and Shlomo, literally Vayischazek means he became strong, or he strengthened, meaning Shlomo took solid control of his kingdom. V'Adonai Elohav imo, and God, the Lord, his God, was with him. Vayigadleu l'mala, and God made him great and great heights, really great. Now, this is an opportunity for me to mention a little bit when we see often in Tanakh where a king or any figure, because sometimes the prophet and the king talks to the Lord, my God, or in this case, it's the Lord, his God. Just in other words, identifying a person and God as his God, as opposed to our God or the God of the people, or your God in plural of all the people. And obviously, one could think that this means, that, I have my God, you have your God, but that's not obviously not at all what it means. And I just want to emphasize that when it uses this term, it's emphasizing that aspect of God, which is the personal relationship that we have. In other words, we each have a mission on this world in our lives. We each do what we do, based on the circumstances that we're in. We have our own challenges, we have our own mission, we have our own skills, and so on. So when it refers to when David says the Lord my God, or when anyone, we find this in the Torah and Tanakh often. So when it says over here, the Lord God, his God was with him, it's referring to the specific circumstances of Shlomo's life and his relationship with God. God was with him. God helped him fulfill his mission in life, which was to be the great king that he was. So Vayomer Shlomo l'chol, and he was successful because God was with him, and that's the message of verse 1. So what did Shlomo do? Vayomer Shlomo l'chol Yisrael, Solomon said to all of the people of Israel, L'sorei ha'alafim v'hameos v'lashoftim u'l'chol nasi l'chol Yisrael asher ahavos. Right? He said to all the people of Israel, to all of the leaders of the thousands, the leaders of the hundreds, the judges, and all of the Nesiim, all of the princes or chiefs, right? And the heads of all the families. And he said as follows. Vayelchu Shlomo. In other words, he said, I'm sorry, not he said as follows. He said to them, he told them to do something, which was presumably to come together at the Mishkan, at the tabernacle, because that's what they all did. Vayelchu Shlomo, and they all responded to his command, and Solomon went v'chol hakol imo, and the entire congregation with him. And this means the entire congregation, not all of Israel, but represented by those leaders, which we mentioned in the verse before. And where did they go to perform this ceremony, which is we're about to describe? They went la bama, to the altar, right? Asher b'Giv'on, which was in Giv'on. So, and we have mentioned before that after Shiloh was destroyed, Shiloh was where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, stayed for most of the time of the period of the judges. It then went to Nov, Ir HaKohanim, Nov, the town of the priests. Nov was destroyed by King Saul, which we've studied together in detail when we studied the book of Samuel, the book of Shmuel. When Nov was destroyed, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, went to Giv'on. So from about that time, so a couple, I don't know exactly how many years, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was in Giv'on. So that's where it was at this time. Kisham haya ohel moed ha'elohim, because that is where the ohel moed, the tent of meeting, is the literal translation of ohel moed, of God. This is where the people encounter God. Ohel moed is the term which refers to an aspect of the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan, the word Mishkan refers to the place where God resides, right? So that's when we're discussing the aspect of God's presence residing within us. Ohel Moed is always refers to the aspect of the encounter between the people and God. So, which we find this again throughout the Torah and Tanakh. That's what it's referred in this context as the Ohel Moed, because the people were coming. Asher asa Moshe Eved Adonai Bamidbar, the same tabernacle which Moses, the servant of God, made in the wilderness, had now residing in Giv'on. Aval Aron ha'Elohim, but as we learned in detail, both in the first book of Chronicles and in the book of Shmuel, we learned the story of the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark that represents the covenant between God and the people. He'elah David mi Kiryat Ye'arim. We read the story how David had taken it from Kiryat Ye'arim, which was the place where it was being stored. Behechin lo David. He had taken it to where, and it doesn't say the word, but we know the story. We just studied it together. He took it from Kiryat Ye'arim to Ir David, the city of David in Jerusalem. Be'echin lo David. When did he take it? He took it as part of his process of preparing for the temple. Ki noto lo ohel b'Yerushalayim, because David had prepared a special tent for the ark in Jerusalem. So we have the Mishkan, the tabernacle, Moses' old, tabernacle that has been around for quite some time now, and was residing at the time in Givon. But the ark itself was not there. However, Umizbeach HaNechoshes, the copper altar, or copper are really bronze. I try to translate nechoshet as bronze because that's much more accurate. Asher Asa Bitzalel ben Uri ben Hur, the famous one, which was built by the Bitzalel, who was the one appointed to build the tabernacle back in the desert, back in the wilderness under Moshe. Bitzalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, Sham, there, meaning in the wilderness, Lifnei Mishkan Adonai, he built it there before which was before, meaning because when you walked into the temple, into the tabernacle, one sees first the mizbeach hanachoshes is outside. It's in front of the Ol Moed of the tent of meeting, which is the more holy part, where the other the other uh the other items, the other holy items were, like the menorah, the shulchan, the candelabra, and the showbread, table of showbread, and the mizbeach of the incense, the altar for incense, etc., the golden one. Okay, so anyway, so this one was there before the Mishkan Adonai, before the place where God rests. So here we flip to the term the Mishkan. Before we called it the Ohel Moed because we were referring to the people coming to meet God, and here we're referring to the Mishkan Hashem, the place where God resides. In other words, the place that represents God's presence within us. Vayidrasheu Shlomo v'Hakol. So now the Shlomo and the people came and met there and searched out this place and came there to meet to worship God. So what did they do? So Vayal Shlomo Shama Mizbach HaNachoshes Lifnei Adonai, and Shlomo there brought up, he came up, he approached the Mizbeach, the altar, the bronze altar before God, Asher L'Ohel Moed, which was at the Ohel Moed. Again, it flips to the other term, Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. It keeps flipping back and forth, but it's appropriate for this verse because here it's talking about Shlomo's encounter with God. So it calls it the tent of meeting. Vayal olav olos olaf, and he brought upon the altar 1,000 burnt sacrifices. So as part as an object, or as a act of worship, an act of prayer. Balaylahu, on that night, as often is found after a person approaches God, prays to God, etc., and performs this kind of worship, then he may receive a prophetic vision. The level of inspiration goes to the point where he then encounters the divine and hears a message. And what was the vision that Nira Elohim l'Shlomo, that God showed to Shlomo, to Solomon? Vayomer lo, he said, Sha'al ma'eten lach. What God appeared to him was by asking him a question: what should I give you? Okay, you're the king now. You're in charge. What is it that you want? You're coming here to pray. What kind of a king are you going to be? Like, what do you want? Vayomer Shlomo Elohim, and Shlomo Solomon said to God, Ata asisa im David avi chesed gadol. You did with my father David a tremendous kindness, a tremendous favor. V'himlachtani litachtav. And in other words, that's number one. And number two, you made me king in his place. So, I owe it all to you. And this is extremely important, that Shlomo comes before God not saying, I'm a great guy and therefore I deserve it, but rather you and your great kindness and your graciousness made my father the king and gave me all this. So Shlomo immediately has the humility to recognize that it's not him. He's not the great one, but he owes it to God. Atah Adonai Elohim. So now the Lord God, Ye Amen Divorecha. May your words be proven true. Those words, Im David Avi, that you spoke with David, my father. Ki atah himlachtani. You are the one who made me king. He re-emphasizes that point, right? How al am rav ka'afar haaretz. You made me the king over this great nation, this nation that is so numerous as the dirt of the ground. Referencing back to all of the blessings that God had given the forefathers, about how the people of Israel would be as numerous as the Afar Aretz, Shlomo, as the dirt of the ground. Shlomo recognized and understood that he is the fulfillment right now of all of those prophecies, all of those promises. And so, and therefore, may the words you promised my father, David, that his son and his descendants after him would be the monarchs, would rule over the people, may those words be made true. And And how what's my role in this? How can I play a role? In other words, you, God, have the power to make your words true. But in order for me to fulfill the mission that you have given me, Ata now, Chachma Umada Tenli. What I need is the wisdom and understanding so that I can go out before this nation, stand in front of them, v'avoa, and be eitz avoa, and I can bring them in and out. In other words, this is it's a term we have sometimes. Let's say avo is a term we find often among the prophets, meaning I can guide them, I can lead them. Because who can possibly have the skills to understand and know how to be a proper judge over your nation, this great nation? There's so much packed into these little words, but just to point out, Solomon, number one, recognizes his unique position. He realizes that more important than anything, he needs understanding, he needs wisdom. For a leader to lead, he needs to know. He needs to know everything possible about the people he's leading, about the challenges that they have to face, about what the potential solutions are to the problems, who the enemies are, who the friends are, how you run an economy, how you run a military, how you take care of justice. I mean, there's so much. And for me to do this, I need to know, I need wisdom. So immediately Solomon asked for not his own glory, his own greatness, but he asked for the skills that he would need to be the proper leader so that God should fulfill his promise and keep the monarchy among the descendants of David. So this is an important, very important request, and we hear God's response in verse 11. Vayomer Elohim l'Shlomo, and God said to Solomon, to Shlomo, because this is what was in your heart, right? You didn't ask about being wealthy, about having lots of property, of having so much honor and glory. And you didn't ask me to kill all your enemies. You didn't even ask me for health and a long life. But rather, you asked for wisdom, asher tishbot es ami, wisdom because you knew and understood that that's what my nation needs for you to judge my nation, asher mlachticha, that I made you king over. In other words, and you also recognize that your kingdom and leadership comes from me. You don't owe it to your own greatness. You're such a great guy that I made you king. It's very important for us to think about what this says about the kinds of leaders that we should choose for ourselves. Leaders who understand that it's their responsibility and they're there in order to be leaders, to help the people, to lead the people. And they're not there because they're the greatest thing in the world, but they're there because God gave them this tremendous responsibility, privilege, but also responsibility to be a proper leader. And how to do that, the most important thing is knowledge, is understanding the issues and understanding how to do what needs to be done. Therefore, I am giving you what you asked for. I'm giving you wisdom. I'm giving you understanding. You have it. And I'm also going to give you those things you didn't ask for, which is wealth and property and honor. Such wisdom and honor, and such wealth and honor that there have never been has never been a king before you that has had that, and after you, there never will be. This is interesting because, I mean, even in that time, you could have looked back. There were plenty of really powerful kings in the history of the world prior to that. And afterwards, there were plenty more powerful kings. But the point here is, what does this mean when God says there never was and never will be? One could say on face value, oh, it means Shlomo is so great that, and think that Shlomo was the most powerful and wealthiest king ever in history. And certainly he is described as a very powerful and wealthy king, both in the book of Kings and in what we're going to be studying together here in the book of Chronicles. But realistically, I don't think that's what it means here. It means because there never was and never will be a Shlomo that had the unique circumstances and the unique place in history that he had to fill, and to a large extent did fill. With the failures as described especially in the book of Melachim of Kings, which we studied together, and a little bit here too, we'll be studying. But the bottom line is, and the truth is that every successful leader, every person, there is no one like him before and no one like him after, because the unique circumstances that we all have to encounter and come to is something that's unique to us, and it's special. And what God is saying is that because you have taken the humble path of wanting to be the proper leader of the people, and that's what you ask for and that's what you seek, I will be there to help you and make sure that you are going to achieve things that no one else before you has and no one after you will. Vayavo Shlomo labama asher b'givon Yerushalayim, and Shlomo then came um, to he had come to the Bama, to the altar which was residing in Givon. He came from there, Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, Milifnei Hol Moed, from the place where the tent of meeting was, the place where the tabernacle was. In other words, he left the tabernacle in Givon and went to Jerusalem, Vayimloch Yisrael, and then he became the king. So this was like that was like the coronation ceremony, appearing before God, worshiping and praying God to show people what the focus of this new kingdom is going to be. Vayesov Shlomo, and now it starts to talk a little bit about Shlomo as he is the king over the people of Israel, and he starts to establish what is going to become a very powerful, very wealthy, very strong monarchy, and it begins to describe that. So what did he do? Vayesov Shlomo rechav uparashim. Remember, we said he asked for wisdom, and God said, I'm going to give you wisdom, but I'm also going to give you wealth. And now it starts describing the wealth. There's a teeny tiny little bit of criticism here where it will talk soon about his wisdom, but it doesn't talk about his wisdom first. It talks about his wealth and his power first. Um, but which was to some degree part of his flaws, which we're not going to be focusing that much on in this book, like I said before. Vayesav Shlomo rechavu farashim. Shlomo did gather together and chariots and riders. Vayhilo elef yarbameos rechav. He had 1,400 chariots, ushneim masar elef parashim, and 12,000 um, riders. Vayanichem Ba'arei Harechev, and he placed them in the towns, the cities of the chariots, the Im Hamelach B'Yerushalayim, and he also had some with the king in Jerusalem. So this is important, and this is he needed to do this. He set up an army and spread them out, in different cities that were built across Israel, in order to provide military protection and support and to enforce his rule over the kingdom. And the king had so much gold and silver that when he stored it in Jerusalem, they were like stones. There was so much gold. They were as valuable as just like rocks. The Ace Ha'arazim. And the cedar wood, which was a very valuable commodity, which, as we've seen before, was imported from Lebanon, was Nasan Kashikmim. He had so many and he stored them, as many as there were sycamore trees, Asher Bashefela, which were in the Shefela region. Larov, there was so many, they were very plentiful. The sycamores, apparently, at the time, they still grow in Israel, of course, but at the time, they were plentiful. They were like the dominant tree in the land of Israel, as opposed to cedar, which was a much larger tree and much more valuable wood. But so he had so much cedar that it was as common as the sycamore. Umotza hasusim asher l'shlomo mitzrayim, and the place where he where he imported, right, where Shlomo imported the horses from, was Egypt. Umi Kiveh, and from the place called Kiveh, a town in Egypt. Socharei Hamelech, the king's merchants, Mikiveh Yiklu b'mechir. They would buy the horses for whatever the price was in Kiveh. Apparently, there was a lot of horses there, so you can get them at a good price. And they paid whatever the going market rate was in the town of Kiveh. Vayalu, and then from the town of Kvei, which was in Egypt, Vayalu Vayotziu mi Mitzrayim, they also brought up and imported from Egypt Merkava chariots. Apparently, they would manufacture that's they were big arms manufacturers then, and they manufactured chariots. And he bought them b'sheish meos kesef for 600 silver pieces for each chariot, v'sus b'chamishim u'mea, and each horse was purchased for 150 silver pieces. V'chein l'chol malchei chitim u'malchei aram bi'adam yotziu. So and then and this is what they did, and they would take it and sell it to the Chitim, the Hittites, and the Arameans. So in other words, so those are people, the Arameans and the Hittites are people that are north of Israel. So and Shlomo's position was juxtaposed in between. And we know this from archaeological evidence from the time of Shlomo, that the cities that he had built up that we mentioned before were cities along the road that people would take traveling from Egypt through the land of Israel into the rest of Mesopotamia, which is, the areas which are now Assyria, Iraq, and etc., Turkey. So, so by buying down there, right, and selling up there for a profit, Shlomo made a lot of money. And he also built alliances this way, both with the people to the south of him because they wanted Solomon's money. They had good business going. They were his arms suppliers, and with the people to the north of him to whom he was selling the arms. They were dependent on Shlomo for the arms. So he built alliances this way and made a nice money based on the geographic location that Shlomo took advantage of being the guy in between, the guy who controlled the road between there and there, the source and the manufacturers of the horses and the chariots, and the customers, which was to the north. So Vayomer Shlomo livnos bayis l'shem Adonai, and Shlomo then decided that once he established his kingdom, he established a good source of revenue. He's secured his relationships with the major powers of the day. Now it's time to build the house in the honor of God, Ubayis L'Malchuso, and also a house for himself, a palace for himself. So this concludes the first chapter of the second book of Chronicles. Thank you so much for studying together with me this chapter. Looking forward to studying chapter 2, reading more about the exploits of Shlomo, of Solomon, and of course the entire book of Chronicles together. Have a wonderful day.